Good morning, everyone. Why don't we get started with our introductory remarks for our next panel. My name is Todd Winterhalt, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Communications, Marketing, and the Corporate Strategy Officer at Export Development Canada, or EDC. Pleasure to be with you today. Maybe a warm welcome for all that have joined us from various locations across Canada. Certainly nice to see folks again in person and to do this live, so to speak. I'd like to begin my opening comments by a quick word of thanks to Perrin and to the Chamber team for the opportunity to speak at the event, but also really to take a moment to thank the Chamber for what has been decades of an ongoing relationship between EDC and its members. The insight, the knowledge, connections, and ultimately the friendship we've built over the last number of years are of a huge benefit to EDC and to our customers. In addition, I'd also like to thank the Chamber for raising matters of national importance to the forefront and really giving the time and energy to discuss them here today, and for the relentless championing of the Canadian business community. For those of you that might be a bit unfamiliar with respect to Export Development Canada, our mission is to help Canada and other countries around the world engage in international trade and to enhance Canada's trade competitiveness. Since EDC's inception over 77 years ago, we've helped facilitate over $1 trillion in Canadian exports and investments. We aim to leverage our international network, our offices around the globe, economic analysis and research, and our deep knowledge of global markets to better connect Canadian companies to international opportunities. Alongside partners like the Chamber, as well as through other collaboration efforts with financial institutions and insurance providers, we help to support and protect Canadian businesses as they grow and expand to new markets. I am particularly pleased to be on today's panel and opening the panel with respect to a topic that is of great importance to Canadian business, exporters, and communities. Moving goods, services, data, and people across Canada and around the world is fundamental to our national prosperity and competitiveness. Indeed, perhaps more than many other nations, Canada relies on the unimpeded flow of trade. Trade as a percentage of Canada's GDP reached as high as 83% in the early 2000s, and today checks in at around 65%. In other words, over 65 cents of every dollar earned in Canada is tied to trade. Trade makes our companies more competitive and more productive. It raises our standard of living, creates millions of jobs, and brings us products and services not readily available here at home. Yet, as a country, we are facing unprecedented challenges to our critical and trade-enabling infrastructure, and it's placing pressure on our businesses, consumers, and communities. With inflation hovering at 40-year highs across most of the industrialized world, war in Europe, the lingering effects of the pandemic, and recent natural disasters in Atlantic Canada and the United States, it becomes clear that the need for reliable infrastructure is crucial in ensuring Canada's resiliency through periods of economic uncertainty. We need to see forward-looking investment in infrastructure not as a cost to be borne, but rather as a mitigant to global risk that will pay dividends for all of us in the long run. We mustn't also forget about Canada's need for additional and improved digital infrastructure, which is at the heart of our knowledge economy and which has enabled businesses to adapt to new models. As I'm fortunate to travel across Canada and speak with Canadian companies, a few of the common themes that surface with regard to critical infrastructure are the following. First, and very similar to Perrin's opening comments, supply chain disruptions remain very much top of mind, and they affect every aspect of Canada's economy, exporters, importers, and consumers alike. They require strategic investment attention. A resilient, reliable core and trade transportation infrastructure is key to Canada's ability to adapt to climate change and prosper sustainably. Companies tell us that an aggressive, ambitious, and visionary style of leadership is required to prioritize and strategically invest in the trade-enabling infrastructure that Canada requires to compete on the global stage. Governments need to continue to partner with the private sector, harnessing industry expertise and insights when developing the trade infrastructure investment strategy. Finally, Critical and trade-enabling infrastructure is strongly linked to the Canada brand. At home, manufacturers and exporters need confidence in their ability to move product and service to and from existing markets. And on the flip side, international buyers will select alternative suppliers if they lack certainty in the delivery channels and platforms for their purchases. So I know we'll touch on these and many more themes in the upcoming discussion. Once again, I'd like to thank the Chamber for the opportunity to open the session, and I now have the pleasure to introduce Aylin Lusi, Vice President of Public Affairs at UPS.
Thank you very much, Todd, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. Gosh, what a pleasure it is to be here today. So I work for UPS Canada and have been in the transportation, trade, and logistics industry for almost a decade now, but I still get a real kick every time I see so many people come together who are also equally invested in this topic, which is just so important. And today's panel is on critical infrastructure, which is, of course, a bit of a catch-all term for the systems, technologies, processes, services, and operations that are essential to the health, safety, security, and economic well-being of Canadians. So very much, I guess, essential services at the best of times. And as we all know, over the last couple of years, we've not consistently experienced the best of times. There have been a number of challenges. What we also know is that looking ahead into the future, there will be new challenges facing Canada's critical infrastructure. So for our discussion today, over the next 30 minutes or so, we'll be exploring with this panel of experts that I'm very excited to introduce in a quick moment. We'll be exploring a couple of things that I think lead on quite nicely from both Perrin's remarks this morning as well as Todd's just now. We'll be looking at Canada's infrastructure deficit and some perspectives on what might be done to address it. We'll be looking at infrastructure resiliency and adaptability, and then we'll also be closing off with a bit of a look ahead as to some of the challenges and opportunities that face Canada's critical infrastructure. So I cannot think of a better or more qualified panel who I've had the pleasure of meeting and speaking with just before we came on stage here today, who just have a wealth of experience between them from their organizations. Starting on my left, we have Craig Landry, who is Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at Air Canada. We have Divya Shah, Senior Director for Investments at the Canada Infrastructure Bank. We have Arthur Nicolet, who is the CEO of TransDev. And last but not least, Peter Xotta, who is the Vice President of Operations and Supply Chain at the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. So a great range of experience and expertise to guide us through this discussion this morning. Enough from me now. I'd like to hand over to our panelists, just each in turn, to give you an introduction to themselves, their organizations, and some of their top priorities. So, Craig, let's start with you.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It is a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. I guess talking about, infrastructure and even just looking out and seeing so many people all together in one room, we're still at the period, I think, where we're remarking that we're, actually congregating live and in person. This is, not us sitting at our dining room table on a Teams event. So it's great to see so many people live and here and in person. And it's also a bit of a reminder, I think, of what we've been through for the last 2.5 years, which really has been, the devastating effects of the COVID pandemic. I think few places, that was obviously felt everywhere, but few places were probably as acutely and as directly hit as the airline and the tourism space were. There was certainly no guidebook in terms of what we've been through for the last 2.5 years. I myself have been with the company for 28 years, and I've done most of the functions on both the commercial and the operations side. And I can tell you, there were days when we were just sort of staring at the walls, kind of wondering quite what to do next. But here we are. We've made it through on the other side. I'd be remiss if I didn't note that Air Canada has been in the news a little bit the last couple of months. We had a bit of a, speaking of infrastructure, which we'll talk about a great bit, It was a bit of a bumpy start for us coming out of the very, very rapid startup of the pandemic. I think as most people saw in June and July, Air Canada did struggle a bit to deliver, our operations to the standard that we would have normally liked. And there's an interesting, what it really laid bare was the ecosystem of infrastructure that exists that is required to deliver. There's not just the airline, there is, many other stakeholders that are involved in that, from, customs and border to airport security to caterers to fuelers to ground handlers to supply chain issues, and the list kind of goes on. And certainly the industry struggled with that for the first couple of months. For what it's worth, today I was chatting with some folks who've been traveling recently. Things do seem to be a lot better today. In August and September, our numbers have pretty much come back to a pre-pandemic level. But it certainly was a great insight into the infrastructure associated with the airline industry, and we'll be looking forward to talk a bit more about that today. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Craig. Divya, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, and Craig, thank you for that really nice introduction. So I'm not going to repeat what you said, but it is good to see everyone this morning. And thank you to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce for having us here. So my name is Divya Shah. I'm with the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And for anyone who knows us or may not know us, I'll just do a little bit on the Canada Infrastructure Bank. We are a crown corporation of the federal government, and we have $35 billion that we need to invest in infrastructure, and we have 5 priority sectors that we look at, one of them being trade and transportation. Our definition of trade and transportation is quite wide. Our boxes and the edge is a little blurry, so it is up to us to understand what are the needs of the market and the needs of the industry and try to address that through investment and financing. But we look at everything from working with the port authorities to build or expand their terminals. We look at working with airports to build their city-side infrastructure or look at cargo facilities. We look at highways, bridges, tunnels. We look at warehousing facilities, logistics parks. We look at freight railway, short line, intercity railway. So it's quite a varied range of infrastructure from our perspective. And the idea there is to work with the public sector, being various layers of the government, so federal government, Transport Canada, Infrastructure Canada are great partners of us. We also work with the provincial and municipal government, but also work with a number of associations as well, such as the Railway Association of Canada, the Canadian Association of Canadian Port Authorities, just to, again, work across the industry to see from a top-down and a bottom-up what the infrastructure needs are. We also work very closely and, in fact, invest alongside the private sector, so working with institutional investors, private investors, developers. And the idea there is, again, we provide concessional financing. It could either be through interest rates or through flexible terms or length of term to make projects happen and be a catalyst to projects. The last thing I'll say about the CIB is that we are very unique, even though we're called a bank. We don't have hurdle rates. Our job is not to maximize profits, it's to look at project outcomes. So I'm measured on, if I think of the port industry, I'm measured by how many TEUs did we increase. If I look at the intercity rail, it's how much ridership did I increase. If we look at the green infrastructure industry or anything related to environment or climate change, it's about how much GHG did we help reduce for every dollar of CIB invested. So our mindset is very different, even though we are due diligence and we act as a lender. Our mindset is very much outcomes driven. So it's really exciting to be here and learn and listen and talk to you about how we can help and be a tool in your toolkit for infrastructure needs.
Thank you, Divya. Arthur.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here and join this panel. Thank you to the Chamber of Commerce. I've been working for 20 years in the mobility industry and at TransDev as well, so always the same company. TransDev is a mobility company. We operate all modes of transport. So from rail, buses, coaches, all mode of transport. We are in 17 countries worldwide. And here in Canada, our operations are based, mainly in Quebec and in Ontario. We are the leader in non-emergency medical transfer in Ontario. So during the crisis, it was also quite challenging to support, hospitals. We are also working on the student transportation, and we are facing currently, the energy transition, and work with, local manufacturers like Lion, to build a new electric fleet, and we already have 60 electric buses in our fleet. And finally, we are working on large infrastructure projects, such as PPP project, public-private partnership. We won in 2019 the Ontario project, which is, a light rail train in Mississauga. And the thing is to design, build, operate, and maintain for the next 35 years. So it's really a long-term project. And that's raised a lot of questions, issues, and challenges also. And of course, I would like to give a couple of words about the past two years during the COVID-19. We struggled a lot. Like Air Canada, at the peak of the crisis, we faced by 50% drop of our activities, and the question, especially the question of our frontline workers, because TransDev, it's mainly frontline workers, 95% of our employees. And it was, really our top priority challenge as well, to keep everyone on board, to keep them. It was a huge bet, but so far we are lucky, and now, the public transportation is resuming, and we are proud of that, and proud also to be a great place to work. Maybe it's due to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arthur. And last but not least, Peter.
Thanks, and I'll echo the welcome and appreciation for being here today. And I think if you've heard anything from the panelists, it's a recognition of the challenge that folks have had. And in many ways, the Port of Vancouver has been a good news story in that context, because business has continued to flow. Some of the comments coming out of our organization have been perhaps viewed as overly optimistic, given some of the challenges that you and some of your member companies have faced. So I just want to call that out, that we recognize, kind of the summary here is that not been the last couple of years that we would like to repeat going forward. But here's the conundrum as it relates to critical infrastructure. My colleague on the panel here has $35 billion and is anxious to deploy it in the supply chain. I'm anxious to take advantage of that, as I'm sure many of you are. But we're heading into a period of uncertainty in the economy, and I think that that means even more senior government leadership is going to be required. I'm Peter Xotta. I'm Vice President of Operations and Supply Chain at the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, and we're the federal agency that has a mandate to actually deliver on the capacity necessary to enable Canada's trade. That critical infrastructure, as you can imagine, is a core focus for us. To manage that balance, we run a suite of infrastructure programs. I'll talk a little bit about that. Environmental programs, and increasingly operations optimization initiatives to really get at that capacity that if we don't use today is not available tomorrow. And so in order to do that, as I said, the alchemy of those three things coming together allows us as a port and as a country and as a community of interest to take advantage of the 170 countries and economies around the world that trade with Canada increasingly and predominantly through the West Coast ports of this country. So 2 points. One is, I want to highlight the policy that's in your package today that's about streamlining the approval processes for critical trade infrastructure. There is money through agencies like the CIB, but increasingly there's all sorts of private money that needs to be, and we need to deploy to continue to protect our competitive position as a trading nation. You heard from Todd how important trade is to our underlying economy. Getting infrastructure built, getting programs deployed, and creating the certainty that has been a hallmark of Canada and North America in terms of trade for many generations, restored and confident going forward is really a key. The second, and you'll hear me talk about this several times, I'm going to apologize up front. The Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project is just such a project. We have a perilously declining partly because of our strength as a trading nation in the container space. We're running out of capacity. We have a large project that we want to get underway. It's been in the federal environmental review process since 2013 or 14. We understand that we're very close to a decision. Frankly, that decision, in my view, is overdue. But in the context of the global challenges that we've had, this is precisely the kind of solution that we need not only to get on with, but other projects of its ilk need to be endorsed and moved along at a cadence that works for you and your members, not what we've been doing. So I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Well, Peter, your introductory comments have provided a beautifully convenient segue into our first question. So I'm going to ask to hear from the other three panelists now on critical infrastructure deficit. I'll start with you, Craig. You mentioned that the last few years have kind of shone a light on the incredibly complex tapestry of stakeholders, organizations, government, public sector, other that are involved and crucial in order to enable successful critical infrastructure. But what does the deficit look like from your perspective, and how could it be addressed?
Well, there are many aspects, I think, to the infrastructure, that's relevant in our context in aviation. There are probably dozens, in fact, but when I think of like critical gaps, there's sort of four, I think, that kind of come to mind. The first would sort of be sort of people and labor infrastructure. How do we ensure that we are bringing forward people with the right skills, the right specialized sets of skills, bilingualism? How do we ensure that we have a talent pool that, that will be ready to help us achieve our needs? Another one would be digital, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about, but everything related in our industry to, biometrics and the ability to move more freely with less friction and more efficiency through the travel process. Another one would be everything related to the green and the sustainability infrastructure, and I'm sure we'll touch on that a bit more. But the fourth one that kind of came to mind is one I wanted to touch on a bit more, and it's really the specifics of the airport infrastructure. Airports are an incredibly unique environment. They're really like mini cities unto themselves in some cases. And the infrastructure, the multi-billion-dollar infrastructure that exists in each individual airport, certainly in the case of our major airports, have significant infrastructure needs. And you have to, if you think of everything from the baggage carousel systems to the intermodal forms of transport to the ability to people movement systems within the airport, runway construction, safety equipment, the list goes on. These are very, very complex projects that need to be invested in and delivered in. You have to reflect also, I think, on, when we think of the gaps, why are some of these things not happening? I mean, if you've been to Montreal Airport lately, you'll see an enormous parking facade that is half torn down, to which construction seems to have all but stopped. You'll see a temporary facility that was meant to build to take over for that is half built and has stopped. And you'll see, an airport that after 2 years of no money coming in, has no capital to really move forward with its infrastructure needs. The airports in Canada are based on a user pay model. So they are assets that are owned by the government but are transferred to local authorities to be run on a non-for-profit basis. In return for that, they pay significant rents and fees back to the federal government for the ability to use those facilities, but they don't receive subsidies in return. Their funding model is based entirely on a user pay model. So which in the airlines case, we pay obviously landing and aeronautical fees to airport authorities. Customers pay airport improvement fees, I think as most of you would know. And airport authorities are also able to generate what they call non-aeronautical revenue, which is concessions and retail and restaurants and so on. And it's this revenue that's needed to be able to try to address the infrastructure needs of the airport. But the projects I'm talking about are billions of dollars. The level of investment that's required to prepare our airports for what they're going to need for the future is of an order of magnitude that vastly exceeds their own ability to self-fund. And so there's also an important question, when I think of the gaps, the infrastructure that most quickly comes to mind is the future of the airport infrastructure and the question of what the funding model for that would be given the way they're designing Canada today.
Thank you, Craig. Arthur, let me go to you next from the public transit perspective.
Of course, the first thing, it was how we manage our frontline workers. I just want to back that, because when we were, in the peak of the crisis, it was really, the key question. And with, this weird virus of COVID, with, I don't know, any, knowledge of how it was dangerous or not, I believe, my first, idea will be how we manage our frontline workers, because we may face a new pandemic. Maybe, we hope no, but we may face a new pandemic, and we need to be better, prepared to face that. So the first thing, how we design our building, our depot, how we design, our vehicles as well. You split, there are some splits between passengers and drivers. That could be the same in airline industry or other industries. So that's a key element. Of course, that comes from IT tools. IT tools can really support, because you can reduce, contacts with that. So it was really helpful, during the pandemic to develop new IT tools to support our operation, and it was quite successful. But also, it's the question, or plenty of questions, the question of the supply chain, basic stuff like spare parts. Spare parts, we're facing, lots of, challenges on spare parts, just, to maintain and repair or to replace our fleet of vehicles, just to run the operations, and it's not yet done. It's not yet done, the situation. So we really need to consider where we buy our fleets. So it's why we are working with, local and Canadian companies, but still there are lots of components of that who come from, outside countries. So we need to consider this aspect. And also, of course, we see also positive things. I talk about, the medical transportation. We work a lot with in Ontario just to, improve, because we believe that the mobility also may have a role and can, improve the efficiency of, the healthcare system. When you move the patient, when you move people, around, it's sometimes better, to move the people than, gather everyone, all the patient to the same hospital, and the hospital are stuck, basically, or not enough capacity. So yeah, plenty of things to do.
Indeed. Divya, with your $35 billion budget, I think we're all very excited to hear your perspectives on how Canada's critical infrastructure deficit might be addressed.
Thank you. And I think when we think of critical infrastructure, when the bank was formed about 4 or 5 years ago, we were already in an infrastructure deficit, a huge infrastructure deficit. And I think the last few years has made a few things very urgent. We've got climate change coming around. We've got congestion issues. We've got supply chain issues. You've got resiliency issues. All of this needs to be combined with the fact that we as Canada want to be the #1 trading partner with the world. So there's also competition from the world. And so if we do not stand up now and start thinking about the next 50 to 100 years and the investment that we need to make, I think we will lose our place as a leading global economic partner. So I think for us, we look at infrastructure, or critical infrastructure, in also a couple of different ways. Of course, sustainability and resiliency is important, but we're also looking at some new asset classes, like we're looking at carbon sequestration, carbon capture, hydrogen, and the whole value chain to make hydrogen a reality for Canada. We're also looking now at critical minerals. To make the electric vehicle evolution a reality, you need more cobalt, you need nickel, lithium. Canada has a lot of that and a lot to offer. So that's a new value chain that we're thinking of. So it's not just the traditional, but it's now new sectors that we need to think about as well. So it's quite exciting for us at the bank, and we believe we're quite uniquely placed. Of course, we have the $35 billion, but I would say the #1 thing that we have going for us is our investment horizon is very long. We look at it from a 30, 40-year perspective. And when we meet with our clients, whether it's public or private, the question I like to ask at least is, If capital was not a constraint, of course, keeping in mind risk and your appetite for risk, but if capital was not a constraint, what would you aspire to build for the next 50 to 100 years? The infrastructure we want to build needs to be transformational. It cannot be for today. We have to plan for the next 50 to 100 years. And as a result, CIB looks at it from, we do not want to look at $50 million, $20 million projects. We are looking at large-scale projects. So our minimum investment size is about 100 million, and we have no upper limit until the 35 runs out, I guess. So it's a really different way of thinking. We want our partners to be bold, and we're here to encourage you and be a part of you. And how do we do that? We can provide flexible financing, concession rates. We provide a lot of developing expertise and structuring expertise. We also have about $500 million that has been set aside to work on feasibility studies, capacity studies, work with the industry on, if I take the ports industry, for instance, we could work with the Association of Canadian Port Authorities to do a survey on what the ports need. When we worked on the New West Rail Bridge, we didn't look at just a rail bridge per se as one project. We looked at it as what is the bottlenecks for the entire region. So we are, again, a very different investor from that perspective. The third thing I'll say is we work very closely with our federal government partners because financing is a combination. Not everything can be funded as government grants by the federal government. I think we do need that. It's a very important component. Then they've created us, which is a financing tool. And then you have the private sector, which is another tool. So I think the goal should be to combine the three and get dollars to go as far as possible to build as much. And then the last thing I'll say from a CIB perspective is that we have we're very streamlined as an organization. So a lot of people ask us, what's your application process or what's your intake window? And we don't have any of that. Have a conversation with me, and that's your intake right there. And our goal is to move projects really fast so we can achieve, investment commitments in 6 months or faster, depending on speed of information available. So, and we do understand that not every airport is the same as the other airport. Not every port is the same as the other airport. So providing a one-size solution does not work. So it is important that we work with our clients on a one-on-one basis to come up with customized solutions. And that's the tool of tricks that we have in our $35 billion investment capability. But again, look forward to speaking a lot more. Thank you.
Thank you, Divya. I hope that you've brought a good stack of business cards. I'm sure they will be in high demand. Peter, in your opening remarks, you talked about a few of the priorities that are top of your mind. Now, based on what you've heard from some of our fellow panelists, is there anything that you would add in terms of how best we can go about addressing the critical infrastructure deficit?
Well, yes, I think all of us are Divya is going to be our new bestie here next time we come to talk about things. She's going to hear from all of us. I guess it's a question, and I really appreciate Divya's comments around the streamlined approach, because I think that's what's standing in our way. There's no doubt there's acknowledgement of the challenge. It's a question of how best to deploy things. And I have to, in spite of my introductory comments around, some frustration with the approval process, acknowledge that our minister has been very active, particularly earlier this year, striking a national task force on the supply chain that produced a report recently that has things that I think would resonate with much of the audience. Certainly it did with us. One of the key things that they articulated is the need for a national strategy. And so while the Port of Vancouver and other ports have benefited from some of the existing programs, it fails, I think, to put a bit of a bow around it in such a way that these things are integrated. And there's two issues there. One is moving through that permitting process that I mentioned, but also signaling to external parties, shippers, users and investors in the Canadian supply chain that Canada has a plan and a strategy that is easy to articulate and that we're following through on, I think is a key piece. So hopefully what that will do is help identify and prioritize those projects that Divya and others can move forward on. The other piece, I think, I just want to highlight that, again, a recommendation from that report is about the need for digitization. You know, Canadian supply chains, we're a country that has a high dependence on trade, on relatively few arteries for trade, unlike even our neighbor to the south of the border. So we've got a tremendous dependence. We need to get it right. Across those supply chains, those limited supply chains, particularly in the West, we have a diversity of cargoes competing for that supply chain capacity. And again, as referenced in my earlier remarks, if we lose a day of capacity, we don't get it back next week because our utilization of our supply chain is relatively high already. So digitization across the supply chain, not just at a port-to-port level, but at a network level, is something that's been articulated as a recommendation, and I think our minister may be making some announcements in that respect as we speak. But that's a critical piece. And I'd say in the airspace, for safety reasons, they're well ahead of having a much higher level of sophistication and visibility across all of the transactions that occur to move passengers and cargo every day. In the road and rail and marine space, less so. And we need to do a better job of that if we're going to have targeted investments in the right place. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. And once again, your comments are an excellent segue into the next section. But just looking at time, what I'm going to propose we do is kind of combine the second and third aspects of our discussion. So I'd like to ask you all, and also challenge you all to perhaps answer me in 1 or 2 minutes so that we can squeeze in maybe one question from the audience. Craig, I'll start with you, and let's talk about critical infrastructure resiliency and adaptability. And then I'd also love to hear your thoughts on managing through uncertainty, which everyone in this room has had to contend with. And certainly in your seat, I think you've had a tremendous amount of experience through that. So in terms of resiliency and adaptability, the challenges of climate change and the challenges that companies like yours face in terms of ensuring that your future operations are safeguarded from an environmental sustainability perspective. Can you talk to us about that and any other thoughts on managing through uncertainty?
Sure. Listen, the airline industry is certainly at the forefront in many ways of what's happening in the sustainability initiatives and movements we're seeing around the world. Air Canada, like some other airlines, has a very significant climate action plan. In fact, we have some very aggressive targets we've publicly set, which is to be a net zero emission by 2050. And we set some fairly aggressive interim targets by 2030 to have a 30% reduction in our ground operations, greenhouse gas emissions, and 20% within our air. So we have interim targets as well. We're doing that by doing things like purchasing new aircraft, everything from the 787 Dreamliner, which is made of composite material as opposed to sheet metal, so it's less heavy, therefore it requires less fuel, to new aircraft like the Airbus 220, used to be the Bombardier C Series, which has a number of advanced features that allows it to be more environmentally friendly. So we're investing, billions of dollars into aircraft that will allow us to draw down those effects. We're working, from a reusability and a recyclability, everything from our flight attendants' uniforms to our seat fabrics. We're making extra, life for that. We're using, alternate forms of energy. And a variety of other activities. So these are all critical aspects for us in terms of delivering against our overall plan. But I will mention one thing from an infrastructure perspective, since that's our theme for the day, is that we will not be able to hit our targets in 2050 without one critical element. We'll do all of what I've described and more, but there's one critical element, and it is what we call SAF, or Sustainable Aviation Fuel, which is fuel that is made from non-fossil fuel materials. Reuse cooking oil, for example, and many other aspects are in this. This is an early industry that is not yet mature, and the cost of sustainable aviation fuel is many, many times higher than it is not commercially viable in any way, shape, or form. But we have a real sense of urgency to try to make sure that we can build an industry around sustainable aviation fuel so that it can become commercially viable. We put $50 million aside for that to try to make sure that we can invest into it. And we're looking to the government and other forms of partnerships to try to ensure that Canada can be on the leading edge of the developers for the future of sustainable aviation fuel. We figure, that'll be a critical element for the ultimate aspects of our climate change. And I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you, Craig. Arthur, from a public transit perspective, how are you incorporating sustainability into your forward thinking, and how are you dealing with the new landscape of uncertainty that faces your organization?
Even if it's not your question, I will answer I will start by the first point about how the resiliency of our operation, and again about the people, because our first challenge today is the shortage of drivers, shortage of mechanics. And if we want that our activities business offer resume and start and grow, we need people. We need more people. So that will be my statement here, just maybe more immigration. That will be a way just, to fill all the position, just as I said, just transport patient from an hospital to another hospital. We struggle to find people to do that. That's critical. So I did that, I said that, so thank you for that. In terms of sustainability, we believe there are multiple points. And I will start, the first approach, we need to be more creative. Because the world is changing so fast, we have so many challenges. Now we need to change the mindset when we release a RFP to design, an offer, and that can speak about it, especially for the mobility. It's no more the question to say, I need a price just to go to point A and point B, whatever, the ridership inside this offer. We need to change this mindset. During the crisis, we changed a lot of our services, from fixed route to transport on demand. We know that we need to be, more flexible and find the best way to tackle, the needs of the population, which could change. And I believe remote working will change a lot also in the upcoming years, the way we are living here. So we need to change the mindset from a governmental standpoint. And that will push, the private operators and whole companies to be more creative as well. More creative, bring new ideas, bring new IT solution, bring, new kind of services, just, to fill the needs of the population, the communities. So I believe that will be great, and with the support of CIB as well, because there is a question of financement. When we talk about sustainability and energy transition, that require, when you buy, just an electric school bus, it's 2 times, sometimes 3 times, higher than a diesel one. So we need financement, long-term contract as well.
Thank you, Arthur. Peter, I'll go to you next. And you mentioned an announcement this morning with the Minister of Transport that's taking place to do with the use of data in supply chain resiliency and efficiency. Can you start off by sharing any further thoughts that you have from your perspective on the role that data might play in your organization's future? And once again, also speak to us about how you are navigating uncertainty.
Thanks. Yeah. Maybe what I'll do is just kind of link a couple of subjects. Some of you may know that one of the signature environmental programs that the port has is something called ECHO. ECHO is about identifying the periods of time when endangered southern resident killer whales are near the shipping lanes in the Juan de Fuca Strait. So the idea is that when killer whales are present, there is a program, a voluntary program, crafted, frankly, to avoid regulation, that vessels will operate slower through that period of time so that killer whales who are endangered, in part because they locate food using sonar, their locating system. So when there's too much vessel noise, they can't find food, thus the population of killer whales is endangered. So in terms of digitization, this program has been in place for a number of years. What we're doing now is leveraging that to layer on something called active vessel traffic management. as opposed to passive vessel traffic management. Passive is come when you like. Active is we're going to schedule and in some instances indicate speed to those vessels transiting the southern resident killer whale areas. Now, why are we doing this? Well, we care about whales. We also want to continue to grow and develop as a port, and that's the underlying, frankly, the rationale for doing it. So that's just one small example of the level of sophistication that we're going to need to have in our supply chain to deal with all of the complexity. Some of it's operational complexity, some of it is political or social complexity that we have in the supply chains that we so depend on. So I see those kinds of digitization initiatives being in the marine space, in the rail space, in the trucking space, and I've got a number of other examples of what we're doing in that area. But the piece that I think is really interesting, related back to the minister's announcement this morning, which I think is talking about the $130 million that they have to make available to advance Canada's digitization of the supply chain, is that individual ports like Vancouver will be doing their bit. What other ports are also doing is similar but not entirely aligned with what we're doing in Vancouver. And I think stitching that together will help the regulator, in the case of ports, Transport Canada and others, have a much better, more dynamic and current view of what's happening in the supply chain, because the holy grail, of course, is for us to anticipate what's happening in the supply chain. And that, in the last couple of years, is clear we're not good enough at yet.
Thank you, Peter. Divya, when you listen to some of the perspectives shared by your fellow panelists, what are the roles that public-private partnerships can play in some of the kind of ambitions and goals that they've set out? I'll also tie this into a question. I've seen a couple of questions specifically for you, Divya, that are coming in from the audience, so a lot of interest. Just, are there any major or kind of top projects that you have in mind that you would see as a priority?
So there's a lot of different themes here, so I'll try to connect them as well. Again, for us, public-private partnerships or public-private financing funding opportunities are really important. It is key that we align interests. The private sector needs to invest, take ownership and responsibility of the infrastructure that they're operating. We, as the public sector, need to make sure the public interest is managed, and we're actually looking at it from regulatory compliance and frameworks, again, to ensure that we are doing everything we need to get Canada as a leading trade partner. The other thing I'll say is that when I hear uncertainty, we look at it as opportunity. It is CIB's job to think about the gaps in projects and try to finance or structure those gaps out using financing opportunities. Now, not everything can be financed out. There are problems that need funding. There are problems that have no solution and need time or technology. So not everything can be solved. But we look at things like at times of uncertainty or recession, there could be a ramp-up risk or a delay risk in more volumes coming in or ridership coming in, and that's a risk that we would look to absorb. Today, we have interest rate increases, inflation increases, so a big part of our thinking is upsizing our facility sizes or delaying, we give principal holidays during the initial years from construction right into operations to help you absorb some of the variability that might happen. So there are things that we can do from a financing perspective. Again, we can't solve all the problems. That's just not what we are here to do. But there are things that we can do that can help. From a large projects perspective, I think we have a lot of things that are always in the pipeline that we can't talk about because of NDAs, but I would say across the board, we have a really large zero-emission buses program. Just a couple of weeks ago, we announced a $500 million EV charging program. We have a team that just works with the Indigenous communities and projects with the Indigenous communities to get them out from diesel and into a different kind of renewable energy, or helps them get ownership of railways that they are operating or different infrastructure that those communities need. We are currently active with the Port of Montreal on a project that was announced on our website a while ago. So there's a number of different projects across the board. I think it's hard to announce them, but again, I think we started with one project in 2018, and we're now to about 34 investment commitments as of the first quarter of 2022. So, in a world and an industry that infrastructure takes a really long time to develop and build, we've ramped up quite quickly, so we're excited.
Thank you, Divya. And I'm so sad to report that we are almost at time. I know it's tradition that as the moderator of the panel between the morning and lunch, I'm supposed to be apologetic, but I don't feel like I need to be, because I think that this has just been such an insightful set of comments and reflections from our panelists. So thank you all very much. Just in closing, I see that we've had a couple of questions here. There's one that's come up on the recent publication of the government-appointed supply chain task force and their recommendations to create a long-term 30 to 50-year supply chain strategy and how that might be achieved. So without wanting to put words into the panelists' mouths, just kind of some takeaways from the conversation so far that I think might apply to this. What I really loved was that the ideas that I think it was Arthur mentioned, we need to be creative. And Divya, you mentioned that we need transformational infrastructure investment, and I just love this idea of creative thinking and taking away the capital expenditure shackles that face many of us in terms of our decision making. Just remove that from the equation for one moment and think about what you would do and where you would want to invest if somehow the capital investment requirements were taken away. So I'll leave you all with that thought. I think that was an excellent set of reflections. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and I'll welcome you to enjoy some lunch.